Hi, my name is Mrs. Leviani. I'm one of the 7th grade language arts teachers here at Saraland Middle School, and I'm reading with you Terror at Bottle Creek. It's a novel by Watt Key. He's the author that wrote Alabama Moon, and he was born here in Mobile and writes about our area. So it's kind of neat to see an author that's writing about the things we know about. As always, I like to ask my students if we're reading something out loud to read along with it. That way you get to see it and hear it at the same time. I think around chapter 15, Mrs. Prater is going to pick up and read the rest, but we're going to go ahead and get started with chapter 1. Dad said it was too early to be worried about the hurricane. So far, all the storms predicted to hit us that season had veered east into Florida. Besides, we'd already been through plenty of them before. It was just part of life on the Alabama coast. I wasn't so sure. The storm I saw on our television was big, and it was taking a different approach than the others. And with a name like Igor, it sounded cruel and deadly. I looked out the window of our houseboat. I'd have to think about the hurricane later. At the time, I needed to worry about Dad's two clients waiting outside in their truck. He was supposed to have been back an hour ago to take them on an alligator hunt. They'd come all the way from Mississippi, and they were getting anxious. I keyed the handheld radio and tried him again. Dad? He didn't answer, but I didn't expect him to. I knew he was just up the road at Mom's rental house, and he didn't want me to know. Ever since she'd walked out on us 6 months before, he'd been going over there and trying to convince her to come back. I knew she didn't want to see him. Sometimes I think he just parked in her driveway and stared at the windows. I walked out onto the deck and looked up at the riverbank. The tall man named Jim got out of the driver's side and leaned against his pickup under the utility light. He twiddled a toothpick in his mouth and looked at his watch. You get him? He asked. He'll be here, I said. The man scraped the gravel with his boot and frowned. My dog, Catfish, trotted up the ramp and leaned against my leg. I knelt and scratched him behind the ears. There was a strong smell of fish about him. What have you been out into there, boy? I asked him. He wasn't much to look at, a dirty yellow mix of terrier and collie I'd found wandering the riverbank a few years before. Catfish thumped his tail against the deck and whined and trembled with excitement. We're going, I said to him. Just hold on. He thumped his tail again. I heard the short, heavy-set man named Hoss get out of the truck. His feet crunched across the gravel. Maybe we ought to call it off, he said. He'll be here, I said. Well, we all heard Dad's pickup coming down the hill. He stopped behind the two men from Mississippi and got out while pulling a ball cap over his head. He hefted his jeans, which always seemed to be falling off of him these days. He'd been thin and wiry his whole life, but ever since Mom left, he looked like he didn't eat anything. She'd sucked the life out of him in more ways than one. Anybody ready to get a 10-footer? He said. We've been ready, Tom, Jim said. Dad approached them and shook hands with each. They grinned reluctantly. Dad put on his carefree act, which used to come naturally to him. Sorry about that, fellas. I'll make it up to you. Gonna put you on Old No Name tonight. Big rascal I've been watching grow for 15 years. Sounds good to me, Jim said. Dad turned and crossed the ramp onto the houseboat and rolled his eyes at me like some people just didn't understand. Well, I understood. He was wasting his time and everybody else is carrying on about Mom like he did. And it was embarrassing. But how does a 13-year-old tell his dad he's being a fool? They almost went back to Mississippi, I said. They'd be sorry, too. You got everything ready? Yes, sir. All right, go on and help them with their gear. Let's head out. That's the end of chapter 1. We're going to continue now to chapter 2. Dad was the best river guide in the county. He took his clients out by himself during the school week, but I helped him on weekends. Now, the alligator hunting season had him busier than ever. The work was tiresome, but it paid more than his usual hog hunts and fishing trips. I gave life vests to our two clients and seated them in the front of our 18-foot flats boat. It was an aluminum hull center console john with 90 horsepower with a 90 horsepower Yamaha 2-stroke outboard. Dad said he didn't like 4-strokes. Said they were too expensive and complicated to work on. If he couldn't fix the thing himself, he didn't want it. Catfish scrambled into the boat and got into position on an old towel in the rear corner. Meanwhile, I cast off the stern and bowlines. Dad cranked the motor and waited until I climbed aboard. Then he put the boat in gear and idled out into the river. "You fellas got everything you need up there?" he asked the men. "We're good," Hoss said. Our clients seemed in better spirits now that we were underway. They both cracked a beer and toasted each other. I returned to the rear of the boat, got the spotlight out of the dry box, and plugged it into the accessory port on the console. "You got the emergency gas?" Dad asked me. "It's up front," I said. "We really going all the way to Bottle Creek tonight?" "I reckon. Get off this river. We won't have anybody messing us up out there." The alligator Dad called No Name lived in a slough on Bottle Creek. It was about as far into the middle of the swamp as one could get. If a person had heard of the place, it wasn't because of the fishing or hunting. Near this creek, shrouded beneath a tall canopy of cypress and water oaks, are the ruins of an ancient Indian civilization. Archaeologists refer to the place as the Bottle Creek Mound Site. There are no roads to it, no markings on maps, nothing to even signify the place except for a faint footpath of white sand. Dad continued idling out into the river, letting the engine warm up. I triggered the spotlight and waved it across the water, then triggered it off again. We wouldn't need it for a while unless we heard another boat coming. We'd run dark without any navigation lights until we got deeper into the swamp. At night it was easier that way. It wasn't legal, but we could see better, using the dark wall of the trees rising on either side of the bayous to guide us. Lights or not, there was always the risk of hitting a deadhead, a submerged log or piling. But Dad had to run the swamp since he was a boy, and he'd memorized where all the hazards were. "Nice night," Dad said to the men. The water lay black and still, pressed beneath the thick greenhouse smell of the heavy air. It was unusually warm for late September, and the frogs and insects still cheeped and pulsed from the marsh. Across the river, the swamp fell away for miles, calm and peaceful. I looked up and studied the sky. It was cloudless and speckled with stars. "What you think about that storm out there, Tom?" Hoss said. "We're here, ain't we?" Dad said. "They seem to keep throwing 'em at us this year, don't they?" "Long as they keep throwing 'em into Florida, I don't mind," Dad said. "You boys ready to run?" The men shifted and steadied themselves on the beach. The men shifted and steadied themselves on the bench seat as Dad accelerated the boat onto a plane. I glanced down at my shoelaces, making sure they were untied. We'd both ride standing up in order to see better. If we hit something and got thrown out, it was important to be able to kick off our shoes. A person can drown easily with shoes on. The boat leveled out, and we were soon racing across the black mirror of water with the wind whipping at our hair. I knew we might not be the only boat running dark until we got deeper into the backwater. Usually we had the swamp to ourselves that time of night, but with alligator season in, there was no telling. I trained my ears to listen for engine noise and kept my finger ready on the spotlight trigger in case I had to flash a warning signal. We veered off the Tensaw River into a small bayou where the trees rose and hung over us on either side. Dad played the steering wheel, gently brushing it left and right, each of us drifting into our thoughts behind the steady noise of the engine. There used to be nothing I looked forward to more than going out with him, but ever since Mom left, things had changed. Now, even though Dad was right beside me, it felt like I was alone, and everything he'd taught me about the swamp seemed useless. I just didn't see the point in it anymore. "You all right?" he asked me. I kept my eyes on the trees and nodded. He knew what was bothering me, but he was poisoned with it. He couldn't get her out of his head, and I didn't understand it. She was sure out of my head. I never wanted to see her again if I could help it. "Been a while since we've been to the mounds," he said. "Yep," I said. We used to hunt and fish along Bottle Creek, but it had been a couple of years since we'd made the trip. The first time he showed me the mounds is one of my most vivid memories. He took me back there late one afternoon when I was 6 years old. We left the John nosed into the brush, and he hefted me onto his shoulders and ducked into a narrow trail. After a few yards, the trail widened under giant cypress and water oaks. The swamp was suddenly dark and cool and strangely still. The only sounds were mysterious bird calls, distant and shrill from the high canopy. Raspy green palmetto plants and large mossy vines made it feel like a lost land from the dinosaur age. He carried me for nearly a half a mile before I saw the mounds rising out of the gloam. They were eerie and ivy-colored with something from another realm, a long time ago. The first few hills were no higher than Dad's waist. As we continued, they grew larger until we arrived at the highest, nearly 50 feet tall, rising into the canopy. He set me down, and I followed him up the steep incline until we arrived at the top. We stood there beneath an old juniper, staring into the branches of the canopy beyond. "Hit that left bank," Dad said, interrupting my thoughts. I triggered the spotlight briefly on the river bank ahead, just enough for him to see a dark gap in the trees. He nodded and started a slow turn toward it. After 30 minutes of weaving through the maze of creeks and sloughs, he eased back on the throttle. The boat sat down in the narrow creek and we continued on, idling slowly beneath the Spanish moss and cypress limbs. "All right, fellas," Dad said. "Let's get us a gator." And that's the end of chapter 2. I'll see you tomorrow.